Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Future of CRE Sustainability. Today, I'm speaking with Isela Rosales, Managing Director and Global Head of Sustainability and Responsibility at Bridge Investment Group. Isela, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Sean, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, excited to meet with you today and have a chat. As someone leading sustainability across multiple property types, what's the most unexpected way you've seen green initiatives directly impact the bottom line?
Great first question. I would say if I just start off with the common ones, the common green initiatives, typically you're looking at in real estate, replacing old appliances, old equipment, certainly trying to find more efficient options, and also looking at the building's envelope, looking at how that could get improved for, again, energy efficiency, and then expanding to things like thermal comfort, structural integrity. And then right now, there's a lot of emphasis around renewable energy. So how can that potentially be introduced to a property? So if we just think of that, that's really continuing to remain. Now, if we think of next level, so what would be on that next level of green initiatives? I personally am very interested in the ones that involve a focused effort on mitigation and resilience. So what does that mean? It means that these are measures, actions, education that takes place in a way that can help a property owner prepare for whether it's the next season, the next weather event. And the ones that are strongest are the ones that are tailored for each property and would allow that property to withstand and recover from potentially very large environmental impacts. And the reason I really hone in on those as, maybe not the most expected, but certainly the most valuable is that we're talking about protecting a property's value. It can also reduce any long-term repair and maintenance expenses. And overall, at the end of the day, whether we're talking about office buildings, multifamily apartment buildings, you really want to minimize disturbing that property's business and its presence. And all of this, I mean, a lot of folks talk about bottom line impact. So, I also am constantly looking at that as well. And so again, not necessarily unexpected, but the ones that are coming more into the scene of various green initiatives. Just to give a few examples, it can be anything from in the construction process, considering things that are more flood resistant. You think about roofing and drainage systems, making sure those are well maintained. Technology, I mean, you can't really go anywhere without talking about that. So, and that includes things like smart building systems, but then also taking existing mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, making sure those are being run through regular checks and tests. Thinking about your backup systems, and then also I mentioned the building's envelope earlier, but again, like thinking about what it's going to take to ensure that you are running the most efficient energy and water-wise efficiency for the building, thermal comfort, structural integrity. These are all just very important, not to be taken for granted. And last but not least is also thinking about those that are on site at the property. And again, like training, education for those on-site staff, it goes a long ways. So a lot of it is sort of keeping traditional practices, but also considering as our world modernizes, how do we incorporate some of these more modern approaches?
How have institutional investors' expectations around ESG in real estate evolved over the last few years?
That's a really good question. If I were to focus on institutional interest, broadly speaking, and expectations as well, I could say there's been shifts, especially in these recent years. And if I want to dive into that a little bit more, and let's just take the US. I'm here in the US, here in California. So my lens is often what's going on in the US with definitely an eye to everything else outside of the US. So in the case of the US, there's a lot of interest around what's going on from, say, public and corporate pensions. And we're seeing a spectrum of interest there in sustainability. We've got the groups that are making shifts and potentially prioritizing it less. And then you have those that are saying, no, I'm going to stay the course. I'm going to stay in my same lane. I want to keep my sustainability commitments. I want to prioritize it across my investments and portfolios. irregardless of what's happening around me and irregardless of maybe the environment that I'm surrounded by. And then you've got a whole another grouping of institutional investors. You could think about endowments and foundations, impact investors, family offices. And at least from what I can tell, if they were focused and prioritized ESG and sustainability, they're maintaining that position. They're
Right.
maintaining their beliefs on how it adds value, whether they're heavily focused on the environmental side, the social side, or corporate governance. I mean, it really depends on their own, call it mission statement. I mentioned outside of the US as well, right? So from there, I feel like it tends to be a lot more regional, where you've got regions of the world that continue to very much support sustainability attributes. They think and prioritize a lot about impact investing for real estate. And you see it throughout their investment life cycle. So we see it when they're doing due diligence. They come to their asset managers and they approach them with pretty intense questions, and it's a very rigorous process that they put their asset managers through. And then if they become an investor in a fund, they're very good about doing those annual check-ins, and they'll want to see and hear about the progress of that company's sustainability program. They expect reporting, they expect a certain amount of disclosures. And then, like I said, for the regions of the world that weren't on board previously, chances are they probably haven't gotten on board, unless, of course, maybe they had a particular mandate that they needed to execute where sustainability needed to play a role.
As you look at the broad commercial real estate market today, what are some of the most consequential climate risks that property owners maybe aren't paying enough attention to?
Yes. So I know that in this day and age, climate risk and insurance go hand in hand. Maybe before I dive into that, one of the topics that I really enjoy talking about with my peers is this concept of climate value at risk, or you might see the acronym climate VaR out there. And for those that maybe don't know what this means, I can give a bit of context.
Sure.
So the thing to understand about climate risk is there's really, let's call it, two main components. There's the physical side and there's the transitional climate risk.
Mm-hmm.
At least for purposes of this question, I'm going to focus on the physical risk side of things. So within that, there's a number of practices that real estate asset owners and operators can undertake. So they can go out and adopt software that'll allow them to run what's often called natural hazard assessments. So using this third-party software, they can perform a range of scenario analysis. What happens if hurricanes hit my properties, this portion of my portfolio? They can also go pretty extreme, like if it's a real major catastrophe, what might the model tell me now, way before any of this might ever happen? And for some people, it's scary. It's quite daunting to think in that scope of this sort of catastrophe modeling. But the reality is that's the way insurance companies think, and they have to. So I really feel like real estate or commercial property owners, it's an imperative for them to think that way too, to think about how can they perform their own physical climate risk assessments in addition to whatever maybe the insurance companies are doing. And they're doing it regardless. So might as well do it yourself too.
Right.
And so what's important too is, okay, so you run these analysis, you run these assessments, and then the question is, so what do you do with them? Right? What do you do with this information? How do I understand it? How do I unpack it? And so from there, you have typically two different types of hazards to focus in on. So one of them being acute hazard. So what falls into that camp would be climate scenarios such as hurricanes, wildfires, flooding. And these often are top of the list because and hence the name acute, because they really do impact operations, financials, whatever is really kind of keenly tied to that property. And so it's important to know what those acute hazards are and the exposure that a property owner has to them. Because from there, then they can start thinking numerically. They can start considering what might be, if one of these hits, what might be my maximum loss to my property? And then how does that translate to my overall financial impact?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can take it one step further. What happens to my occupants of that building, whether it's a commercial building or my residents, if it's a multifamily building. I lose rent. I lose, the ability for these people to occupy, or in some cases, they might be trapped in those properties because of what's happening in the surrounding areas. So all of that to bring it full circle. So when I talk about climate or climate VaR for a property, it is this loss analysis that has to get done to really get that full picture. And in the US, there's a number of resources out there, free resources, and they'll often look at the map of these different areas of the country that have particularly high exposure more than other areas. So you might say, okay, Florida, for example, flooding without a doubt, right? Exposure. However, flooding is not limited to just the areas that have a coastline. It could be inland. So it's important to run those models because those are the kind of things it'll capture. It could be very much an inland location, but could still have flooding risk, could still have exposure to storms, could still have exposure to tropical cyclones. That's another term that they use out there when they're talking about these weather events. So I mentioned at the beginning to the response that a lot of the mindset, I believe, that needs to happen, the shift to prioritizing climate VaR, is really also centered around what's going on with the insurance marketplace. So everybody can agree that insurance premiums are increasing. Some would argue they're slightly stabilized in certain markets, but the other catch is also the coverage. Can you get coverage in certain areas? Here again in California is now a lot harder, if not impossible, in some areas to get that coverage. And so I know too from speaking with colleagues, insurance companies do their own analysis, but if a property owner can also do their own and make a convincing case, like, I have this property, I know it has X exposures to these different hazards. However, we've also done the following to protect, to mitigate, to make this property more resilient. They may accept it, they may not, but it's always worth trying. And insurance companies may decide to take that into account, and that could work favorably, whether that's premiums being more stable, maybe even a little bit better, and then just getting that coverage that has just been so hard to get in certain areas.
What trends are you seeing in the CRE space around clean energy investment, things like solar, battery storage, and EV charging?
A lot of folks are definitely interested to learn. You've got a spectrum of those interested to learn all the way out to very active practitioners. If you look again across the US, there's certainly markets where the incentives are better than others. Here in California, it's such that for any new solar installations, you have to also have battery storage. They go hand in hand, those projects. And then you also have the folks that are interested in it from a economic and financial standpoint. Maybe they don't have the capacity to bring solar on site to their properties, but they want to invest in companies, or they want to take part, say, in community solar. So they want to have that exposure, or maybe they want to do offsite solar. They want to be able to allow their residents or tenants just to have access to renewable energy. And maybe they think beyond just, again, if we can't bring it on site, what are some other ways to bring that exposure? The other thing I would say is we are living in a world where pricing is getting impacted, whether we're talking about tariffs or we're talking about just the sourcing of the materials. That is likely going to take more of an impact than it had in recent times. So that is a big question still, how much of that impact could translate to some level of slowness in adoption here. But I would say the interest is still quite strong regardless. So it'll be a matter of properties and projects that were deemed feasible for renewable. And then fast forward to when construction actually is ready to happen. Can it still happen under the initial, financial underwrite to make it a feasible project? For some locations, they have to maybe even have a threshold to make that a viable investment versus just, I want to bring renewable energy on site. A lot of the work that I've been sort of analyzing and studying is just like anything else, when you introduce a new concept in sustainability, there's always the question of is the business case there for it?
Which data points are proving most valuable when it comes to making sustainability investment decisions?
So when I think about what happens throughout the journey of a property, you have
Mhm.
to consider that properties that are built typically have a very long lifespan. And so during that lifespan, there's going to be a lot of changing hands for those real estate properties. And in my career so far in sustainability, one of the things that I've noticed, which has been both an opportunity and a challenge, is how important it is for that historical information to follow the property. That
Mhm.
historical data, as many of the property characteristics to follow as those properties change hands. I know from practical experience that includes things like, can we get our hands on historical data on energy, water, and waste
Mhm.
on this property? We are the new buyer looking at this property. Can we get our hands on as much of that monthly history as possible? And the other thing that's also really interesting in real estate is from the outside, you might looking in, you might say, oh, it's one property. But depending on how that property is organized, for example, multifamily, and if it's a large property where it's not one building, but it's a campus,
Mhm.
you'll often find yourself having to be smarter with your questions. It's not just, I'd like the history, the utility history on this property, but you have to be very specific. I want the full, or a phrase we use in my world, whole building data. I
Mhm.
want the historical data on the entire property,
Yep.
which involves a lot of collaboration, often with service providers, utility providers, et cetera. The other thing that's also important is, again, talking about data and history that should hopefully follow the property as it changes hands, is everything to do with mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems. Like knowing what you're really walking into, so then you can understand, okay, what's been the repair history? What have been the recent replacements? What do I, as a next owner, want to forecast for my next 5, 7, 10 years, however long I think I'm going to own it, and I can
Mhm.
start planning accordingly. You asked me earlier also about renewable energy, and that would be another consideration today as a data.
Mhm.
Do I have clear information as to, depending on the location of this property, are there incentives for
Yep.
me, financial incentives for me to consider renewable energy systems? Has this property been evaluated in the past for potential installation? Were there any potential roadblocks that I should be aware of? And then last but not least, I think it's extremely critical that when properties change hands, that the new buyers are given the opportunity to do a full walkthrough of the entire property. So if we're talking about a suburban multifamily apartment type of property, and there are 500 units that comprise that property, a thorough due diligence would actually involve walking through every single one of those units
Wow.
just to get the, again, this is all information, this is all data that, whether it's sustainability oriented or not, it helps capture what's important for making these investment decisions. Now, the other thing I want to say to this question, which I think is also really, really important, is actually having to do with regulatory compliance.
Mhm.
So here in the US, while we don't have a comprehensive federal, call it sustainability ordinance, we do have things happening at the local level.
Mhm.
And that can be at the city, county, and or state level. And for those that are in the space, they're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. But just to set the scene, these are what we call local building regulatory ordinances and requirements. And those include typically benchmark ordinances and then building performance standards, or BPS for short. There's quite a few of them already, with a lot more coming on the horizon. In the case of benchmark ordinances, again, talking about changing hands when properties are sold, whoever the current owner is, when deadlines come around every year, they're the ones responsible for having the prior year's 12-month history of energy, sometimes water usage. So if you don't get that at the time of sale, it becomes really hard to go back and try to get those data points. And there's a risk you might be out of compliance because you can't get that information. Now, in the case of BPSs, which is, call it one step further in complexity,
Mhm.
um, property owners have to be mindful of whatever the BPS is for their local area. So take, for example, Denver. Denver has something called Energize Denver. And then there's also things happening at the Colorado state level.
Mhm.
Property owner has to be mindful of. So in the case of a BPS, there's some level of commitment that has to be made, and everyone is different. Every BPS is unique, where a property owner has to commit to some type of carbon emission reduction pathway, just to put that generally out there. And the obligations often start with some type of pathway compliance. Like property owner has to say, okay, by June 1 of this year, I have to pick a pathway of how I'm going to get there. Now, it may be that by the time enforcement comes along 2 or 3 years down the road, we may not own that property. That being said, the decisions made for the property today will follow the property. Just like if we go out and buy a property in 3 years, the decisions made by the prior owner will follow the property. And then we're the ones that have to carry that responsibility. And a lot of the compliance right now is expecting property owners to either check in or have some type of progress report submitted
Mhm.
in 2026 and 2030. So this is not stuff that's like many, many years out. We're talking it's around the corner. So everyone I've been talking to who's following this, they're like, oh my gosh, we need to get more people on board. We need to educate. We need to build this awareness because, well, some people may think it's not a priority. We and I believe it really is for anyone that's a real estate asset owner today, because lack of compliance for something like this, we're talking financial penalties, we're talking reputational risk, and you could even argue could impact potentially sale pricing and just transactions overall.
Tell me, how are you seeing tenant-landlord relationships evolve when it comes to sustainability goals?
The first thing I would say to that is a lot more information sharing, which is good. This is what we want to see happening in our industry. And it can go both ways, which is also another remarkable point of progress. Historically, you could argue that the landlords would drive the information flow one way to the tenants, and tenants could take it or leave it.
Yep.
Nowadays, it very much feels like landlord and tenants alike can be incentivized to be engaged, to find ways to have their properties operate more efficiently. We all want to save money, whether that's through utilities, whether it's through also just improving the comfort, the experience level, call it, of residing in that building or working in that building, whether it's improving air quality, improving the space and how it's utilized. I've also seen that, especially on the commercial side, property owners are recognizing that if they want to stay competitive, they have to improve the sustainability profile of their property because that's what's going to help drive occupancy. It's also going to help drive potentially rent growth over time and also retention of tenants.
Mhm.
And then you take that same logic and you go over to residential type, whether that's multifamily, single family, student housing, even seniors housing. Those residents are very much appreciating when an owner, the difference between an owner that does or doesn't improve, modernize, amenitize. And if sustainability is also part of the mindset, that's a win-win, right? It's a win for the property owner. It's a win for the residents.
Mhm.
I previously talked about building performance standards, and just to kind of tie it here, you could also look at how those regulatory expectations are, whether it's forcing or encouraging property owners to think about ways to reduce the footprint of their properties, therefore decarbonize. So when that's there, that mindset's there, then there's a lot more thought behind how do I make things more energy efficient? How do I integrate renewable energy? If I can access a cleaner grid, a lot of grids are, making a lot of effort to become cleaner over time.
Mhm.
That again is another benefit for both the property owner and the tenants. And then the other thing too that I'm seeing is, again, more now than call it a decade or more ago, is in commercial buildings, if the tenants themselves are coming to the discussion or coming to the agreement that they themselves have their own sustainability commitments, their own goals, and They want to press upon the property owner how important those goals and those commitments are. And so when they are out there shopping as to where they want to have their company located, which office building versus this one versus the one down the street, chances are they're going to prioritize the buildings that are, call it, more sustainability oriented. That could be they have a green building certification, LEED, Energy Star, well, any of those that are out there. They want to see that a property owner is committed to reducing emissions. They want to see smart building technology, etc. So again, I think whereas before it was just the property owners often in the driver's seat, I would say tenants now equally are in that driver's seat to be able to influence what they want out of their properties.
That's great. What is a creative sustainability solution that you've seen work across different property types?
It may seem simple, but I would say flexibility.
Mm.
Because when you have flexibility as a property owner, you can think about your tenants from a range of perspectives because all tenants are going to be unique. So when I think about when, say, commercial property owners are being more flexible, they're going to have hopefully a broader range of sustainability goals and initiatives.
Mm.
And you can start to think about which ones are going to resonate more with certain tenants versus others. And then similarly, when you're thinking about residents that are residing in different property types, whether that's multifamily, let's take even affordable housing, seniors housing, each of these resident groups are going to have probably different interests. And the more that a property owner can be flexible and tailor to those interests would make a difference. I'll give you an example. So with commercial buildings, you could have any number of floors where a tenant occupies one or more floors, or you could have individual tenants on every single floor. And so you have to consider what are amenities, what are services that will appeal to all of my tenants.
Hmm.
So that can be things like a green roof, right? Having that rooftop that's got some great greenery, whether that's trees, whether it's succulent plants, whether it's, reusing of rainwater, etc. We know that solar is very much an attractive feature of a commercial building. So if that's available, then that enables things like EV charging stations to also be present,
Hmm.
which could be a very attractive feature for tenants. And then even the social side. We've been talking a lot about the E. Now thinking about the S, like on-site cafes with healthy eating options,
Hmm.
intentional work towards, clean air. So these are all things that I would argue probably attract all tenants. And then from there, you can consider, well, do I have mostly larger tenants or smaller tenants? And figure out I need to be flexible for each of their interests. If I look on the residential side, sustainability solutions, they're going to look a little bit different. But again, a lot of it's going to be centered around what's attractive to the resident base across that entire property type. So I know with, say, multifamily housing, especially when we're talking like affordable housing, where the residents are very much financially constrained and they very much appreciate a property owner that's engaged with their residents and not just collecting rent, but really thinking about services that they bring on site to the property. They're very programmatic in nature, focused on who's living there. So whether it's programs for the adult residents, families, youth, senior citizens. And then with that, you can create a captive audience.
Mm.
And that captive audience can be great for when you want to introduce things like, here's some great ways to save water. Here's some great ways to conserve energy.
Hmm.
We really want you to be engaged at our resident events. We're going to, touch these residents through, various forms of communication, whether it's seasonal emails, whether it's through resident apps. And then you can consider, for example, with something like seniors housing. So similar, but different. Again, because you want to be flexible. Senior citizens and their residents' sense of community has to really be there. So a property owner who's attentive to very much the S that conveys, engagement across those residents, I think is going to definitely do a lot better than a property owner of seniors housing who's, again, just there to collect rent and not really have ways that residents are engaged. Um, and then last but not least, I would say across all property types, a property owner who is thoughtful and engaging when it comes to safety, when it comes to things like this is what we're doing to keep you safe, to make this property more resilient. Should something unfortunate happen, we've already thought about this ahead of time. We want your input, but we want to make sure that these are elements that are part of our operations every single day.
So you just mentioned the E and the S of ESG. How does one successfully integrate social impact goals with environmental initiatives?
So one of the cool things about this industry that I'm in is there's a lot of different programs out there that property owners and operators can research and decide if one of these is appropriate for them. And then through that, they can also say this program allows me to integrate the social impact goals alongside all of my environmental work. So just to name a few that I think are well known, but also to just, highlight the impact that these programs can have as groups decide to adopt them. So one of the most, I would say, probably most important universal programs is actually run through the UN. It's called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. There's 17 of them. And what's really cool about them is you've got the 17 goal areas, and then behind them, you have 169 target areas, which is really cool. So this can be across real estate, but this can also be across sectors. So firms that decide that they want to show their support, their alignment to any of these 17 goals or any of these target areas, they can do so. So whether it's something like the first SDG is focused on supporting the end of poverty, and that can also include housing, affordable housing. And then you've got things like goal number 2 that's focused on ending hunger, achieving food security, improving nutrition, promoting sustainable agriculture. And depending on the goals of an individual firm or their KPIs, they can kind of go through this list and select, oh yeah, goal 1, it definitely aligns with some or part or all of our work. Or, goal 10, which is focused on reducing inequality. Like they can decide which of these they want to align themselves to. And a lot of them are socially oriented, but there's also the environmental ones. To name another one that I think has been really helpful for our industry to give guidance on metrics and such is one called GenIRIS. So that's for Global Impact Investing Network, and these IRIS metrics. So we really appreciated what this program has had to offer because it allows asset managers, doesn't have to be real estate, to translate their social impact intention into real impact results. And we find that a lot of institutional investors will come to asset managers asking them, do you apply or do you intend to apply and integrate the Gen Iris metrics to your work? So there's a pretty extensive catalog of these Iris metrics. And then the other cool thing is Gen Iris recognize that there might be groups out there that want to do both. So they actually have a crosswalk between their metrics and the SDGs that I was just talking about. The other thing too that I just kind of want to bring this full circle on is I want to make sure that it's not an either or. Like you can't have environmental and social impact initiatives and goals. Like they can truly coexist. I mean, I'm just thinking of, for example, earlier this week, I was talking to some peers about affordable housing and what does this look like in our space? How are people partaking and bringing more solutions to this area? And whether it's going to be an asset real estate owner and operator that is focused on preserving affordable housing, or I want to be focused on creating more of it, and or I want to do one or both of those and also incorporate and track the social impact I can have by not just being that owner operator, but also coming in and bringing programs, whether it's on-site programming, services for residents that they may not be familiar with, having dedicated employee staff that can be there to help roll out these programs, help manage them. There's also real estate asset owners I find can either be truly committed to keeping, say, a property affordable, or they buy it affordable, but over time it changes. So for those that are truly committed, they will take it one step further and say, I commit to keeping this property affordable by X definition, whether it's half of my units or more have to stay affordable by this a financial metric. Often the common one is area median income. And I commit to keeping more than half of my units always reserved and occupied for people that make, below a certain AMI. And then, as I said earlier, you can have the social impact metrics in the picture alongside the environmental one. Just because you're doing work in, say, affordable housing doesn't mean you can only do one. You can still do the environmental side. You can still do all the work on conserving, having water and energy conservation measures. How do you reduce costs for your residents? How do you introduce amenities? Solar, again, can be part of that lineup.
How are new technologies changing your approach to sustainable building management?
I'm a fan of technology, so I can at least say that much. I really think it's the next frontier. I mean, we're seeing it already from how we are making progress in both, the data collection, the data tracking, the implementation of programs, better oversight of our building operations, preparing or being able to make the building more resilient because I've got, enhanced leak detection systems. I've got, monitors that are allowing me to rely on my employees, but then the employees rely on that technology. Right. So I would say when I think about how technology has helped us also solve challenges, I think that's an important piece of this. One of the key areas of just what I do, what my team does, is we do a lot of work around collecting environmental data of our properties. It's hard work because a lot of it is very manual. And as we talk to more technology focused platforms and companies, we're constantly figuring out, is technology going to help us solve some of these puzzle pieces that we struggle so much to do? And that can be like a concept like shadow metering. So if I've been striking out and getting utility data from the utility company, can technology help me solve this problem? Potentially, yes. Something like shadow metering allows devices to be installed at properties. And there's some argument out there. What's the tracking error? Could I get within 5% of actual consumption? Hopefully less, hopefully a lot more accurate. But that's an option that historically we would not have had. And there's a lot of companies in the space, some better than others, but it's something that, we continue to look at. Now, sometimes it's financially feasible for a property type, sometimes it's not. So I think it's always good to consider what forms of technology will help certain property types versus being maybe not as applicable in others. And the reason I say that too is not to get too much in the weeds, but if I think about residential and the capacity of residential multifamily, you can have high rise class A properties versus low rise, mid rise, could be class A, but often a lot of that housing product was more class B or than class C. Shadow metering for the latter of these, so class B and class C, especially if they're garden style, is a great concept, but likely going to get too expensive. So may not be the solution there. But again, this is where a lot of companies that are in the space are trying to figure that out. The other thing I would say too, maybe looking at, kind of call it smart building systems, because technology really has helped us understand how to have a platform, whether that's, some refer to it as the building automation system or the building management system, BAS or BMS. The idea with these systems is that you can integrate a whole host of technologies so that you can not only get a sense for like what's happening at my property when I'm not there, but it's everything from, is my building optimizing energy use? Am I creating an environment that's comfortable for my tenants? I've heard these stories of buildings in New York City. It'll be absolutely cold outside, but yet the AC is still cranked up in there. You're just like, wait, this isn't working. It's not a good use of energy here. And then I know there's a lot of office asset owners that are looking at things like even sensors to monitor occupancy. They really want to be able to see their energy and water usage in real time.
Mhm.
Um, and they want to try to figure out, can I tie some of these metrics? Because again, technology can help me. Can I tie it to the satisfaction that and reduce my work orders that I may face if I didn't have this technology, right?
Yeah.
And then just overall, I mean, I mentioned earlier, technology helps us with collecting data. It also helps us with transmitting that data to where it needs to, get into the hands or get into other systems so that they know what's going on at the building. It allows for that enhanced automation control. You're not at the building, but you want to know what's happening there. And then if I even take it one step further financially, like a lot of analysis can be done through technology measures. We can make decisions. We can hopefully better control cost management when you're getting that data. But again, data has to be accurate. Technology has to make sense in order for this all to work for the given property.
Is there any emerging trend in sustainable real estate that's creating a big opportunity for positive impact?
I mean, technology definitely. We were talking about that just a moment ago. So I think without a doubt that's definitely not only an emerging trend, but it's going to be a continuing trend. I would say the other trend that's tied to that, but tied more so to the renewable energy side of things, I'll call it the energy transition, just to broaden it a bit. But it's really this concept of, can we start to think of all the different areas that we can make the shift from being a fossil based energy system that is typically what we have in a lot of buildings, and shifting to being a lot more, if not exclusively reliant on renewable energy sources to, reduce that carbon footprint. And we've seen examples across the board, US and beyond, where there's just been this different stages of adoption. So my hope is that we'll just continue to see evolution in that adoption, especially for places that maybe haven't started but recognize the benefits. And the reason I kind of said energy transition broadly speaking, because in that I'm also putting in things like just building electrification. So again, where you're taking what were traditionally fossil fuel based systems, gas furnaces, boilers, water heater, stove, and all of that is getting transitioned to the electric alternative. So that would be the heat pumps, the electric water heaters, the induction stove, and then you've got also hopefully cleaner grids coming up. So, but all of that is part of this transition that I refer to as the energy transition. The other trend that I'm seeing is, and this is going back to something that's been around for a long time, but the next, call it generation of it. So
Mhm.
the green building certification programs.
Yep.
So you've got things that are very popular, like LEED, which goes back to, the late 90s. LEED has actually undergone a number of updates. They just underwent their latest one recently. They're now in version 5. And one of the things that they decided to do with this latest version is really enhance awareness around 3 main areas that they had. It was part of the program, but it was certainly not in any way enhanced, and it wasn't, call it, a requirement. So they definitely have increased what they expect for each of the different levels. So the 3 areas that they're now really focused around is decarbonization, quality of life and ecological conservation, and restoration.
Mhm.
So I was looking at this just to understand, lead version 5 a bit more, and they've reset the scoring such that about 50% now of the points is tied to operational energy performance, electrification, and embodied carbon and materials. So it's essentially all that to say that the prerequisites for lead are certainly more stringent than they were before.
Mhm.
And I would expect that other programs are either following suit or will follow suit in making their requirements more stringent. And then the other trend, I mentioned that while we don't have, at least in the US, we don't have a federal level, call it climate disclosure requirement. We had one, got paused. What's happening at the city, county, and state level in terms of their emission reporting requirements, their pathway compliance, those are very much still in play. And I would say, as an emerging trend, we're going to see more of that. I think you could even argue you might see more because we don't have the federal one. So the cities, counties, and states are interested to say, well, we still want to hold some level of obligation and commitment to this.
Last question, Isela. Projections for future energy use year-over-year are rapidly increasing. What role can renewables play in helping to meet that need?
Well, putting aside, or I guess you can't really put it aside, but you really have to think about there's going to be the interest, how that may or may not change, and hopefully the interest will continue to grow. Then there's going to be the level of adoption, which again, hopefully will continue to grow and grow in the right direction. But then there's also the barriers. So there's all the traditional barriers of, can we still make it financially feasible to bring renewable energy to all these different parts that don't have it today? But right now we're in a evolving environment. So tariffs, access to supplies, whether it's the solar panels or the components for EV charging stations, that right now is undergoing a lot of pressure. And it's also, there's discussion around what the Inflation Reduction Act may or may not face, because it's coming up against some, milestone deadlines here now and into the next few years. So it's one of those areas where, for the people that have been in this space, they really want to continue to see progress, but they also have to recognize that there might be forces out of their control that could impact just how much progress is made in the short amount of time. However, there's been more than enough research to show that the benefits are very real of renewable energy. Now, that being said, there is also the school of thought, if we're doing a lot of work now, there's been a lot of work done. Lifespan of solar panels is 20, 25 years, even 30 years if you maintain them well. So what's going to happen when you fast forward into that timeline? Are we then going to be faced with having to recycle, repurpose a lot of the material that was used to bring that renewable energy on site? How can we continue to increase the lifespan of existing equipment today? So that's also, again, another area of this whole frontier of what happens next. But I think it's important to consider both the intention as well as the supplies that are needed, the hardware that's needed to make this happen, and then what else is going on. The forces that are going to allow us to keep moving forward are the forces that might unfortunately slow the rollout of renewable energy, at least as much as we want to see it.
Appreciate you taking that full circular vision on that question. For my listeners who might want to learn more about Bridge Investment Group or the great work that you're doing, Isela, what's the best place for them to go?
Sure. Well, we've been publishing annual reports there on our website. We just published our 2024 report at the beginning of June. And we have some other reports available as well in our archives. So I welcome folks to visit our website and go to our sustainability page, and you will find the reports there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again. And to my listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Future of CRE Sustainability. I'll see you next time.